how in the world are we going to get a student excited about a piece, whether it's a recital piece or anything else, if the student doesn't hear it? So the first thing I would do would be to play this piece, and okay, it starts on really on A, doesn't it? We have A again. Third time A, but are we going to get somewhere with it this time? First, we ended up back on what? A. We never got anywhere. Now we start on A again, and there we go. We're getting somewhere. Whoops, where do we end up? Back on A again. We're kind of in a rut here. We do it twice. Third time starting on A. Oh, the composer takes a different route. What's different about the route now? Black keys. Oh, let's see if we can get out of this A rut. Still going. Not got to A again. We're back. And oh dear, where are we? Back where we started. For heaven's sakes. Okay. Just not making the grade here. Third time, starting on A. Now, if you had started on A and you were trying to get out of this A rut, and both times you had started on A and you'd gone higher, what might you do the third time? Try it going the opposite direction, and that's exactly what the composer does. Except, where does he end up? A an octave lower. And finally, where does he end up? Way down there. So what we're really kind of doing is digging a hole in this piece. Where A is the established thing. We're trying to get away from A. We tried twice to go higher, and we ended up back in that same A. Third time, we take that A and we try going lower, but where do we end up? 2 octaves lower on A. See, those are the kinds of things that I think could turn a student's imagination on to the form of that piece. Okay, then the student would take the pencil and we would mark and label those 3 parts, A, A prime, perhaps A2. All right, let's look at, now remember, I'm talking to the student now, not to you necessarily. Let's look at the first A part. And what do you see about the right hand? In fact, you might say the right hand of the whole piece is made of what? Chords. What kind of chords? First inversion, 6/3 chords. And in the first section, the A part, are those all white key chords, or do they involve some black keys too? All white key chords, exactly. We see in the A prime section that in this route that the music is taking, the chords are alternating between all white keys to all black keys, white, black, back, and then there's a combination. Some are white, some are black. So this is an entirely different kind of structure, isn't it? There's still 6/3 chords. Now, if you look carefully at the second page, student I'm talking to, there's one place where it's not a 6/3 chord. Look on the second page. Where do you see it? In the second line? Can you find the chord that's not a 6/3 chord? Aha, what kind of a chord is that? Aha, okay, would you put a circle around that chord? And why don't you write 6/4 there, just to remind you. How many 6/4 chords are there in that line? There are 4. That's the same 4 over and over again, isn't it? The second line, second measure we have. There's the first one, second one, third one, and the fourth one. And I would ask the student to circle all 4 of those. Note, I didn't do the circling. The student did the circling in the writing, even if it takes more time. And then what about from the third line on down? It's all what color chords? On the piano, they're all white keys, right? Back to the other. Once we've analyzed the structure of the right hand, we would discuss, of course, how to practice those chords. What suggestion would you make to the student? By this time, the student ought to know it anyway, without you even making it. How would the student practice those? Okay, so you would not play any repeated chords, because that would be a waste of time, wouldn't it? You don't need to. We know you can sit there all day and do that. What we want is to see the hand play, prepare. each position, so that on the rebound, the hand ends where? Covering the next chord, right. And so that the direction is never up in the air. It's never in toward the wood of the piano. It's always to the right or to the left. And no excess motion. Now, when doing this, I would ask my students, I think, to not make those staccatos quite so staccato initially, just so we can get a hold of that technique, so we can feel the chord in our hand. The staccatos, I think, are easy to, I wouldn't say, you're not going to connect, but keep them a good handful of chord there. Let's continue on for a moment with the right hand. In the fourth line, at the end of the measure, where the black key chords begin, I don't know about you, but for many of the students that I assign this piece to, their hands are rather small, and I like them to use finger 5 on all of those chords. That's a matter of personal taste, and it's something that we can decide based on the student. If, however, I think the point I'm making is that if I want a student to use the 5th finger there, then what has to happen? You bet. You don't go home with a 4 and play a 5, or vice versa. So I would ask the student to take the pencil and write in a 5 for a few of those chords and say, okay, then you've got the point. So anytime you see a 4 there, just use the 5th finger. I think that fits your hand a little more comfortably. What other point do we have to make about those chords at that initial workout, assuming that this week we're going to assign that section? What other points do we want to make or point about those chords?
I found it helpful to notice that the top note is the same thing as the left note is playing.
Yes, very good. What else about the chords themselves? I was hoping that you would mention the fact that the hand has to see itself in relation to the keyboard topography there. So the student isn't doing this. In and out. But rather, we're going to position the hand on the black keys so that they go to the white keys right there. So that there's still only a lateral motion to the right or to the left. No in and out motion. So that the hand is adjusting to the topography that's created by the combinations of white and black keys. And I think that's a critical thing for the student to experience at the lesson. Now, one would not have to do that, certainly with that whole section. I think just taking perhaps the first measure there, going back to the black key chord, and then taking 5th line, 4th measure, where there's a different kind of chord. Again, thinking about staying up where the black keys are with the short fingers, fingers 1 and 5. I think with many students, if I were going to assign the piece hands separately, I would assign the whole thing. Because so much of repetition exists, and it's not that big an assignment. When the A part comes back each time, we've already practiced much of that. So I think I would assign all the right hand. Now, to your suggestion of the left hand. Do we want this? About your students, but I know that there are a lot of students that would play it like that unless the teacher made a point on exactly how are we going to deal with the phrases. So we see that the first phrase is to there. And I noticed in somebody's music yesterday that there were check marks to indicate where not to connect. Am I right? Do you use that system? You use some system that indicates that you're not going to connect that phrase to this one. And I would have the student first hear the phrase shaped the way we want it to sound. I would have the student play just that phrase, shaping the end of it. Maybe just beginning with the 2 notes at the end. And then adding on to it. And then and then with the upbeat, putting in a check mark, Second phrase we don't have to do because it's exactly the same. Now what do you want to do second line? Do you want to do this? Or do you want to do this? Or do you want to do this? There are all those possibilities. Now, I'm not here to try to convince you that one is right and others are wrong, but rather that that's a decision that has to be made at that first lesson. However you want. Do you want a long phrase there? Do you want the big, where you have the short measures? Do you want, and then do you want this legato right to here? Do you want so those are the decisions that you've worked out in your own mind about that piece before you go in. And probably it's going to be marked in your own music, and the student then will experience that at the lesson. It doesn't take a great deal of time, but the points have to be made so that next week we don't hear just one long melodic line from beginning to end. I would start with the desired sound, I think. I would say, okay, look at the left hand at the first line. The first phrase is how long? 2 measures. How do you think you're going to play that last note of the first phrase? Louder or softer, the same as the other notes? My students would all say less loud. They'd say tapered. All right, listen to it. Did I do what you suggested? All right, let's hear you do it. A little bit slower, maybe, at this tempo. Or I might say, let's hear you play just the B going down to the E with your idea of how to do the sound. So I would have the student hear it first, based on our analysis of how we want it to sound, and then have the student do it himself or herself. Would that answer your question?
I was just wondering how soon can they start to do that?
I would think if you want them to do it in a recital. Now, I might not do that with every piece on the site. Well, I certainly wouldn't. Because then I would be boxed into a 30-minute lesson where all we did was talk about one phrase. But I'm talking now about a very special piece that I want to have a very special sound and shape at a very special event. So I would do it at the lesson so that the student would have heard it correctly. Now, in my own teaching, I have on the piano a cassette tape player, and I would also record that phrase on the tape for the student. Better yet, I would have the student play it and be his own model. A lovely job. Let's put it on the tape so you can hear it before you start practicing the left hand to remind you of how you want those phrasings to sound. So there's a daily reminder in case we forget for home practice there. The only thing we haven't covered is, all right, are we going to do it hands separately only or hands together? I would think that up to the black key place, probably, students ought to be able to put that together the first week, but at a very slow tempo. I certainly would put that model on the cassette tape for them to listen to, but I probably would also give them a metronome mark. Let's play it with an eighth note equaling such and such. Now you might say, are you going to make a great big to-do over playing the right hand softer than the left hand this week? I probably would not make a great to-do over it. I would have made a great to-do over the phrasing of the melody. But I think the more we ask all at once, the less we're going to get. I think balancing the melody and the accompaniment is something that's quite easy to do once you can play the piece. And you've been brought up with a tradition of how melodies and accompaniments work. And it's very difficult to try to do refined things like that if you can't play the piece. So let's be grateful to have an accurate rendition of that piece at a very slow tempo, at least with some left-hand phrasing this first week. And we'll worry about balancing the melody and the accompaniment later. Now, I know there's a school of thought that says you've got to do everything always at once. And I'm not saying that's wrong. I'm just saying that for my students, I'm really delighted with small achievements, and then we can add a new thing to think about. The more they have to think about, the less well they think, the less clearly they think. The more traumatic they become psychologically. chronologically, so that we get a little bit of everything, but never all of anything. So if they know that all I'm going to hear next week is that piece played slowly with good left-hand phrasing, artistic phrasing, at this tempo, with a nice, rich sound, they can achieve that usually if they know how to practice. But if I throw in dynamics, pedaling, balancing of melody and accompaniment, voicing, etc., 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 I'll probably get a little bit of all of that, but not even accuracy. That's been my experience.